Hello, my friends. Donald Trump has now formally weaponized tariffs against European states that oppose him on Greenland, and he has made it explicit that the tariffs will not be lifted until he gets what he wants. Not a framework, not a pathway, not a mutual understanding, Greenland, period. Over the last few weeks, European leaders have been circulating one especially foolish idea again and again that if they can craft a negotiated settlement, a compromise, and hand Trump something he can sell as a victory, he will back off. That belief was naive in the extreme. I've said it repeatedly because it's obvious from a mile away. Trump is not interested in a compromise that resembles a victory. He wants an actual victory. Those are two very different concepts, and confusing them is how you walk into an ambush with a smile on your face. And pay attention to the ideological backdrop. Do you remember Stephen Miller's earlier statements about international law and how little it matters, especially when the United States decides it doesn't matter? Well, now he's back in the news with equally astonishing remarks. Only this time it's framed around what is fair or unfair about Greenland. You could not make this up if you tried. And yet here we are hearing it from the highest levels of Western power. Let's begin with the tariffs themselves, because this is the blunt instrument Trump always reaches for first. The announced list matters. Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Finland. Starting the 1st of February 2026, those countries face a 10% tariff on any and all goods exported to the United States. And starting the 1st of June 2026, that tariff rises to 25%. At this point, ask a simple question. Is there any EU leader left, any at all, who still believes Trump is looking for a deal or that he's seeking compromise? If anyone still believes that, they are not reading what he is doing. They are reading what they wish he were doing. Because Trump's method is basic coercion, and it follows a familiar escalation ladder. When he wants something, he typically states it plainly, I want X, Y, and Z, and I'm prepared to go to the maximum. Now, the maximum in abstract terms is military pressure. But in real operational terms, he does not begin with military power. That would be strategically foolish and politically costly. He begins with economic pressure, and in this case it is not even pressure in the polite sense. It is economic coercion. That sequence is not exclusive to Trump. It's a standard U.S. playbook that has been used repeatedly for decades. Squeeze the target economically first. If the target still doesn't bend, increase the squeeze. If the squeeze still fails, then the implicit military threat becomes less implicit. That is 101. The only reason people pretend to be shocked is because Europeans have spent so long believing that U.S. coercion is reserved for adversaries, not for allies. But Trump has put it in black and white, the tariff stays until Greenland is purchased. His own words make that unmistakable. The tariff will be due and payable until such time as a deal is reached for the complete and total purchase of Greenland. Then comes the performative flourish about being open to negotiation. But even that is framed as a reprimand. The United States is open to negotiate with Denmark and or the other listed countries, despite all that we have done for them, including maximum protection for decades. So Trump's argument is simple. America subsidized Europe. America protected Europe, and Europe is now being ungrateful by resisting Trump's acquisition of Greenland. And that argument is hard to rationalize because it is built on a dishonest premise that the relationship was some kind of charity project. It wasn't. The relationship between Europe and the United States over many decades was mutually beneficial. Europe got perks, yes, but not for free and not from the kindness of any president's heart. The U.S. also benefited enormously because it used a mechanism everyone knows, NATO. NATO was not merely defense, it was a platform for U.S. power projection, a legitimizing wrapper for American strategic control, and a system that expanded far beyond the not 1 inch eastward mythology Europeans now conveniently ignore. To even try to make sense of Trump's "we protected you, so we deserve Greenland" logic requires swallowing a story that simply isn't true. But notice something important. Trump isn't trying to craft a philosophically coherent argument. He's trying to create a political narrative that justifies coercion. Then he adds the most theatrical and in some ways the most revealing piece of the story. World peace is at stake. China and Russia want Greenland. He insists Denmark can do nothing about it. He claims only the United States of America under President Donald J. Trump can play in this game, and that nobody will touch this sacred land because U.S. national security, and the world at large are supposedly at stake. Here's the problem. The China-Russia claim is a pretext, and it collapses under even minimal scrutiny. I went looking for a single clear statement from Russia or China declaring territorial interest in Greenland. One solitary admission that they want to seize it, annex it, or claim it, there is none. In fact, both Russian and Chinese positions have repeatedly denied such allegations and have explicitly pushed back against being used as a justification for a U.S. takeover narrative. Russia already has an enormous Arctic domain. A basic fact people avoid stating because it ruins the drama. Russia's Arctic territory is vastly larger than Greenland, on the order of multiple Greenlands. Russia does not need Greenland in the way Trump implies. As for China, Beijing's stated Arctic interest is tied to shipping routes, ice, melt, shorter transit, resources, and scientific cooperation, not territorial conquest. At no point did Russia or China publicly say, "Greenland looks appetizing, we'll take it." Yet Trump states it as if it's settled truth. So, when Trump says, "It is time for Denmark to give back," you have to ask, give back what, and to whom? The implication is to the United States, because Trump's narrative frames Denmark and Europe as debtors to American generosity. But that framing is propaganda designed to normalize coercion. Now watch how Europe reacts, because their reaction exposes their strategic incompetence. Over the past days, you saw posturing solidarity with Greenland, vague warnings talk about sending assets. Some governments even dispatched symbolic forces or made theatrical gestures. But the moment those gestures appeared, it was already clear that Trump would not be deterred by tokenism. He wasn't going to engage in a conventional standoff where Europe shows resolve and he reconsiders. He would use other measures to accomplish the goal, and that is exactly what he's doing now. Trump is not looking for discussion. He is not looking for something that smells like victory. He wants the victory itself. Greenland. And it's not only Trump. The statements coming from his inner circle are, if anything, even more radical. Consider the European leadership reactions. They call emergency meetings. They publish statements, and the statements are depressingly predictable. Kaja Kallas claims China and Russia must be having a field day because divisions among allies benefit them. She says if Greenland's security is at risk, it can be addressed inside NATO. She warns tariffs make Europe and the United States poorer and undermine prosperity. And then astonishingly, she tries to force the Greenland crisis back into her single obsession. Do not let this distract from the core task of ending Russia's war in Ukraine. That statement contains two glaring problems. First, the NATO argument is nonsense. NATO is not a neutral forum in which Europe can address you. The United States accounts for the overwhelming majority of NATO's real power. You can call it 80% or more, depending on what you include. If the United States itself wants Greenland, then how exactly does Kallas imagine NATO will solve that? NATO is an institution where Washington holds the decisive weight. You cannot appeal to NATO against Washington when NATO is structured around Washington. Second, the ending reveals the deeper pathology. European elites were so fixated on Russia, so fixated eastward, that they forgot to look westward. They didn't take Trump's Greenland intent seriously. They didn't plan for it. And now they're shocked. Even now, Kallas tries to steer the conversation back to Russia, as if repeating Russia, Russia, Russia will somehow erase the fact that the United States is actively coercing Europe. Now move to Stephen Miller because his remarks are the clearest demonstration of how far this logic is being pushed. Miller's argument, delivered from the position of Deputy White House Chief of Staff, is essentially this: Denmark has failed to protect Greenland and therefore has no right to control it. He claims that under every understanding of law about territorial control for 500 years, to control a territory you must be able to defend it, improve it, inhabit it, and Denmark has allegedly failed all three tests. Therefore, Denmark has no legitimate claim. This is one of the most brazen statements you can hear from a modern Western official because it openly replaces sovereignty with capability. It says, in effect, if you cannot defend it to our standards, you do not deserve to own it. And the immediate question is, whose standards? Who is the judge? Who decides whether Denmark has done enough? In Miller's worldview, the judge is the power that wants the territory. That is imperial logic, dressed up as historical law. And then comes the key point that should end the conversation in any sane international order. Greenland belongs to Denmark, and that should be the end of it. A hard stop. But apparently not anymore. To see how insane this is, reverse the scenario. Imagine a German leader telling the U.S. President, we don't approve of how you govern a remote U.S. region. Therefore, you have no right to control it. Would anyone say, Germany has a point? Of course not. The outrage would be universal, as it should be. Yet here we are hearing the reverse argument from Washington presented as normal. Miller adds the unfairness line repeatedly. It is unfair that the United States pays for Greenland's defense, while Greenland remains under Danish control. It is a raw deal, unfair to American taxpayers who have subsidized Europe's defense for generations. Notice how subjective the word unfair is, and serious politicians normally avoid it because it is propaganda language, not policy language. What's fair to one party is unfair to another. But that's exactly why Miller uses it. He is not speaking to Denmark, he is speaking to the American domestic audience. He is building consent. He is telling Americans you are being cheated, therefore you deserve Greenland. And if the argument is truly about money, if the U.S. is paying and Denmark is not paying enough, the rational solution would be demand more money, demand higher Danish contributions, demand new cost sharing. But that is not the goal. The goal is acquisition. The money frame is just a justification mechanism. Europe then promises a firm response. EU ambassadors convene extraordinary meetings. Antonio Costa criticizes Trump's tactics as threatening prosperity, arguing that markets should be opened, zones of integration created, not tariffs increased. He says he is coordinating a joint EU response. But this is precisely why confidence in Europe's response is minimal. We've seen Europe's pattern. First, solidarity messages, then symbolic gestures, then vague warnings. None of it changes Trump's behavior. Because Trump does not treat European rhetoric as deterrence. He treats it as weakness. Now, the final piece of the puzzle is the supposed China-Russia threat justification, and Denmark itself is undercutting it publicly. Denmark's Arctic commander rejects Trump's claim of an immediate Russia-China threat to Greenland. He says plainly, no, Denmark does not see a threat from China or Russia today. That should be decisive because Denmark is the responsible authority. Yet Trump insists the threat is real. And then the commander adds the classic speculative escape hatch. Once the war in Ukraine ends, Russia could redirect resources to other theaters, the Baltic Sea, the Arctic. This assessment is cited as a reason Denmark expands exercises and invites European allies to operate around Greenland under harsh winter conditions, framed as strengthening NATO's northern flank. So, what do we have here? Even Danish officials say there is no immediate threat, but they simultaneously keep the future threat narrative alive. And that future threat narrative, regardless of intent, feeds Trump's pretext machine. It gives him a story. Even they admit Russia could pivot later. He doesn't need a real threat today. He needs a storyline that justifies coercive action now. This is where the entire episode becomes a case study in how Western politics has been hollowed out. Europe tried to manage Trump with symbolic gestures and theatrical statements. It assumed he wanted compromise. It assumed he wanted a victory-looking outcome. It misread his psychology and his method. Trump wants the victory itself, Greenland, and he is beginning with economic coercion and preparing the next rung if coercion doesn't work. Europe's top officials respond by repeating NATO talking points even when NATO cannot constrain the United States. They respond by obsessing over Russia even as Washington is the actor coercing them. And Washington's inner circle responds with a doctrine that effectively says sovereignty belongs to the party that can defend, improve, and inhabit as judged by the party that wants to take it. If you step back, the strategic picture becomes clearer and darker. The West lectures the world about sovereignty, territorial integrity, and international law, and then, when it wants territory, it pivots to fairness, raw deals, and 500-year rules that magically legitimize acquisition. This is exactly why Russia has been hammering the language of multipolarity and the UN Charter, because Western practice has become openly transactional, coercive, and hypocritical. And if Europeans still don't understand what is happening, February 1 and June 1 are going to educate them in the most tangible way possible. Price tags, tariffs, economic pain, until either Denmark gives Trump the deal he demands or Europe discovers it has far less leverage than it pretended. That's where this is heading. And this is the moment when the picture becomes so clear that it's no longer possible to lie to yourself. This is no longer an allied policy disagreement. and it is no longer a diplomatic drama that Europe can manage with a few solidarity statements, a few emergency meetings, a few moralistic tweets, or a token handful of troops sent into the Arctic. This is a raw power test, a seizure dressed up as security, and Donald Trump is telling Europe plainly that you will pay a price for resistance until you accept the outcome he has already decided. Look carefully at the structure of Trump's play. He does not need proof for the claim that Russia and China want Greenland. He only needs a pretext simple enough to sell to a domestic American audience. Once the pretext is out there, he immediately shifts to the instrument, not missiles, not carrier groups, but tariffs. This is the thing Europe has spent decades pretending not to understand. Before the United States reaches for military force, it often reaches for financial and commercial leverage to break an opponent's will. What Trump is doing is not impulsive anger. It is a pattern. Squeeze with money first, and only then escalate to the next layers if the target refuses to bend. So, how does Europe respond? Exactly as it always does. It recites sovereignty, territorial integrity, international law, NATO unity, and then closes with the ritual line that tariffs will make both sides poorer. Those lines only matter when your opponent accepts the matter. Same moral and legal framework. Trump does not operate inside that framework. He operates inside results. And the result he wants is not a compromise that preserves everyone's dignity. It is a victory that can be pointed to on a map, a trophy outcome, Greenland. That is why the advice to handle this inside NATO is both naive and almost comical. NATO is not a neutral venue. It is a structure in which the United States holds the decisive weight. When Washington itself is the actor demanding Greenland, appealing to NATO as a restraining mechanism is like asking the owner of the safe to investigate the disappearance of the cash in the safe. Alliance consultation is a ceremony. When U.S. interest is framed as national security, consultation becomes theater. Then Stephen Miller arrives with an argument that should make anyone freeze. He claims territorial control depends on capability, that to legitimately control a territory you must be able to defend it, improve it, inhabit it, and that Denmark has allegedly failed these tests. It sounds like a 500-year legal lecture, but it is imperial logic wrapped in academic language. It flips the foundation of the modern international order. Instead of sovereignty being a right, sovereignty becomes a privilege granted to the strong, with the strong conveniently appointing itself the judge. And when Miller repeats the word unfair, that is not policy analysis, it is domestic propaganda. He is telling American taxpayers, you are being cheated, therefore you deserve the prize. This is exactly why the European fantasy give Trump something he can sell as a win was foolish from the start. When your opponent defines fairness according to his own appetite, giving him a little only convinces him that taking more is possible. Once the objective is Greenland, tariffs are simply the ramp. The most revealing detail is that even Denmark's own Arctic commander undercuts the core of Trump's storyline. He publicly rejects the claim of an immediate Russia-China threat. He says, plainly, that Denmark does not see such a threat today. That should be decisive, and yet it won't be. Because Trump does not require a real threat. He requires a fear that can be imagined. And the commander then supplies the standard escape hatch. Perhaps after the Ukraine war ends, Russia could redirect resources elsewhere to the Baltic, to the Arctic. Whether he intends it or not, this keeps the future threat narrative alive. And that future threat narrative is all Trump needs to justify coercion now. So does Europe have any real countermove? On paper, it can threaten trade retaliation. In reality, Europe knows it lacks the room to play chicken with Washington. Energy, markets, supply chains, military capacity, everything shows that Europe has engineered its own dependency. It can posture, it can hold emergency meetings, it can issue communiques, but when tariffs land, Europe must choose between immediate pain and slow structural pain. Trump understands that, and because he understands it, he is confident. Meanwhile, Russia does not even need to act in order to benefit. It only needs to watch the West fracture under its own contradictions. It only needs Europe to reveal what it truly is. A bloc without strategic agency, a bloc that preaches international law when convenient and pivots to fairness and capability-based seizure when it wants something. That is the exact material Moscow will use to argue that the world is moving into a multipolar reality, a world where the so-called rules-based order is replaced by power and transaction, and where Brussels' moral sermons sound hollow. And if anyone still wants to soothe themselves with the hope that some agreement will appear, remember the condition Trump has set for lifting the tariffs. Not progress, not framework talks, not a NATO mechanism. The condition is explicit, the purchase of Greenland, which means that between February 1 and June 1, everything is being pulled onto a single track. Either Europe yields or Europe is forced to yield, and in both cases, it pays for the mistake of treating this as a game. That is the real ending here. Europe is no longer standing between Russia and America as a mediator or as a moral center. Europe is standing in the middle as a hostage to the illusions it has cultivated for years. And in the world that is forming now, those who lack real leverage will be left with words until words can no longer buy time.